Welcome to Vox Rationis with me, Aditya Kashyap, and
Trish.
this is a podcast where we talk world issues from a student's perspective. So let's introduce ourselves, shall we?
Hello, everyone. I'm Trish, and we currently in the 12th grade. Both of us we're classmates, and we do enjoy talking politics with each other apart from microphone. And so we thought, why not bring it onto a platform and have people comment on our views and have people given their suggestions and their opinions on what we think. And yeah, so we're here.
Yeah, and of course, my name is Aditya, and I'm in the 12th grade as well. As Trishit mentioned, he's my classmate, and I too am interested in politics. I also enjoy economics and history as well. And since we're high school seniors, we're going to be off to college next year. So I think for us as budding political scientists, this would be a great way for us to put out our views and with people analyzing and sort of examining how we talk, we can improve our reasoning skills, our debating skills, and in general I think this would be a very, very fun activity for us. So let's get down to business, shall we? All right, so today's topic of discussion is gun laws in the United States. Now, this is a very hotly contested topic at the moment, not just in the US, but also across the world. Growing up in India, I'm pretty sure one of the first things which we think about nowadays when we think about the US is the fact that there are so many mass shootings happening in the country, which I feel is very unfortunate. But nevertheless, especially in the light of shootings such as the Uvalde mass shooting, Texas, I believe it's important that we have a discourse which is not only nuanced but also has some sort of learning that we can come with, because I believe that we all need to be informed about our laws and about the laws before we can really come up and convince lawmakers about what we want them to hear. So let's start off with our personal views, shall we? So, Trish, talk to me about what you think about guns.
Uh, I'm I'm on the stance that guns have to be regulated. I have read quite a bit read quite a bit of articles on a lot of these shootings happening in the U.S. and in other parts as well. So I I read that there's a lot of tragic loss of life occurring, and I feel that certain regulations have to be kept in order to ensure there is some safety and order around. And I do, if I'm not wrong, I think as of the time we're recording, there have been more shootings this year than the number of days which have occurred, and that does say quite a lot. And I find that quite tragic, and I do feel regulations must be necessary. What about you, Kashyap? What do you?
Yeah, so I actually coincidentally grew up in Dallas, Texas. I personally didn't see any shootings, have to say, and I don't think I ever saw a gun up close. So that's personally just my experience. But it being Texas, there is and there was, even when I grew up, a culture of gun ownership. And I believe that, especially, it saddens me when I hear about these mass shootings, the tragic loss of life of our fellow students. I mean, they were probably about as old as us, probably even younger, and their lives were ended with such swiftness. And I believe that justice needs to be served in some way, and it just can't be with putting the perpetrators in jail. There needs to be some sort of consensus made. So whilst I believe that the gun culture is not going to go away anytime soon, I do believe that some sort of regulation and some sort of consensus needs to be arrived at before we can even really even think about any form of regulation. So yeah. All right. So now that we've introduced the topic, let's get to the meat of the discussion, shall we? So I believe that before we get into any debate or any discussion about any topic, be it, it's important that we define the terms, mainly for clarity's sake, but of course, it also helps for the discussion to have more nuance. So, probably the most brought up term when talking about gun laws is the Second Amendment. Now, most of us may have an idea of what it is, but oftentimes our understanding is a bit murky. So, to sort of bring about some level of coherence, I'll leave it to Trish to sort of explain what the Second Amendment is and what we can learn from it.
So, right. So, the Second Amendment goes like this: a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, this can be interpreted in a few perspectives from a few perspectives. And when you look at it, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, and it should not be infringed. So a well-regulated militia is it does imply that there has to be certain rules and restrictions on the ownership of guns. And perhaps the one who brought in the amendment found it necessary for certain said rules and restrictions for maintaining the order when holding weapons for civil society. So then this part where they say it shall not be infringed, it is perhaps the most commonly brought up aspect of the Second Amendment in order to defend the entire right to own guns. And therefore, when you look at it, the question comes up is, does regulations count as infringement? And from the looks of it, it would appear not, because regulated militia and it shall not be infringed is coming in the same amendment here. So I do feel that regulations does not count as infringement, and certain restrictions brought in, it would ensure that law and order is maintained, even though that even though or without the right to bear arms being infringed. You need certain regulations such as licenses and documents to file and certain background checks, etc.
Yeah. I also think a salient point of discussion is the point where they say being necessary to the security of a free state. Now, I find this part of the Second Amendment to be very interesting because I don't think most of us nowadays would associate um, like Krishna mentioned, a well regulated militia to be in any way necessary to the security of a free state. But I believe that some amount of context is required when understanding the Second Amendment, because first and foremost, the Second Amendment was written about 200 years ago, more than that actually. And at the time, the United States had just been founded. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. But before that, lawlessness was pervasive. It's important to note that. And the Americans had just fought a war of independence against the British. And the country was quite divided, even though it had just been newly formed. So there needed to be some way in which the people who lived in the country at the time to have some assurance for not only for their lives but also for their rights, because they were more worried about a tyrannical government. Now, it's many people can interpret the term tyrannical government. It's been interpreted in many different ways, but I think the way in which it was possibly seen back then was that a government which had too much power and too much autonomy to make decisions on behalf of the citizens' rights meant that at any point in time, people could be locked up and people would not really have much of a say. So in order for these essential rights to be defended, like the freedom of speech, like the freedom of press and so on, for these rights to be defended with the utmost certainty, this law was brought in so that citizens had the right not only to defend themselves, but also in the case of this said tyrannical government to come into the picture, that the citizens will be able to defend themselves. So yeah.
Right. So, Kashif, you being an American citizen, what do you feel is the importance of the Second Amendment in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the Second Amendment has huge importance at the moment. Um, as we all know, it's a commonly brought up defense for when someone wants to justify the right to bear and distribute arms. Because the Second Amendment uses quite succinctly the well regulated militia, it implies that there should be, um, there should be guns in the country, and people should be allowed to keep them for them to, protect their rights, as I'd mentioned previously. But I also believe that it's often used as a point to sort of not reinterpret the way in which the Constitution has been written, because, um, and this is the case in most countries, people generally don't want to um, interpret the Constitution in any radical way, because that could lead to all sorts of problems. So I think that at the moment, the Second Amendment is in a it's in a very intriguing position, because currently the discussion, for example, if you've read any of Joe Biden's tweets, he's continuously brought up the point that AR-15s, semi-automatic rifles, they should be banned. In most countries across the world, that isn't a topic of discussion, but because Second Amendment is so prominent in the country, it's generally a very sensitive issue, and one which generally doesn't go very far. All right, so now we're going to get into the first of our two segments on the podcast. So, in this segment, we're going to be talking about this very, very hard hitting question. Do you think guns should be regulated? And if so, how? So, I think this is going to elicit quite a reaction from many of our viewers. And I believe that this is one which many people would be feeling very strongly about. So, I'm going to pose the question to you, Trish. Do you think guns should be regulated? And if so, how?
Right. So I am of the view that there should be few restrictions and regulations on the ownership of guns, because as someone who hasn't really witnessed much gun culture, I do feel that I find it quite scary when you find guns all available around you, and guns can be bought without permits, without certain background checks, without a database which maintains who purchased a gun, how much ammunition they've purchased. So it does create quite a scare within me personally. But I do feel that regulations must be brought in, because regulations do increase the chance of ensuring that there is a bit more law and order maintained within the state, so that people who, let's say, out of the blue just walk in with money, buy a gun, and can use it for use it without a purpose, let's say to kill someone they don't like in general. And it does lead us to a point which is, there have been quite a few shootings by um, there have been quite a few shootings, and especially if the person is, let's say, has certain mental health issues, it does create increasing need to ensure that there are certain background checks performed. It does create the need that certain people the government has to ensure that certain people do not get access to guns. There has to be a specific need to get the guns as well. Let's say, for example, some people may, let's say, I do understand that some people may want to own a gun, to if they live in a large acre, and they're quite scared, if there are quite wild animals around, if they're scared maybe thieves may enter, a gun may ensure their safety. But I do feel that they need to first prove to the government, prove to the seller that they do have a requirement, and only once a need for the guns is maintained, or is proven, can should a gun be sold to them.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Trish. So before I get into my views on the discussion, I think it's important that we bring about a few key statistics, because I feel like whilst we could ramble for however long we want to about our views on this issue, I think there needs to be some clarity on what's actually happening right now. So when you look at the US, there are about 120 guns per 100 residents. AKA, that means that on average, for every person, there will be at least one gun, in their hands in the household. and the US leads in this regard by quite a bit. The second country is Yemen, and Yemen currently is in a civil war. So while the US is not. So the picture is quite it's quite lopsided in the US's favor in terms of number of guns owned. And the next few countries, Serbia and Montenegro. Serbia, of course, had also recently fought a civil war in the 90s over Kosovo. So again, I believe that the US is in a very intriguing position wherein it doesn't have an active state of emergency or active state of war in the mainland, and despite that, there are so many guns per each resident. Now, I think another thing which is important to note is that the US saw record numbers of gun suicides and gun murders recently. I think when we generally hear about deaths caused by guns, we don't look too far deep into it, but it's important to note that actually suicides caused by guns over has almost always overtaken the number of murders caused by guns. So in 2021, there were 26,328 gun suicides, whereas there were 20,958 gun murders. So, of course, those are staggeringly high numbers in their own regards. But it also sort of puts it into perspective that a lot of suicides by themselves were caused by guns. And that on its own is a very, very sad prospect that so many suicides are happening in the country. And I also think that the regulations that Trish had spoken about, um, whilst most people seem to have the view that these regulations should be in place, the average person in many polls has often stated that there should be regulations in the United States. But oftentimes we don't know how or these regulations should actually happen. So, like Trish had mentioned, there needs to be some sort of database of some sort which could be brought about, and I'm sure he'll explain more about it later on. But it's important to note that whilst we believe that regulations are in place in all the states, the majority of them are not very stringent about it. And I think that's very important because despite us having the feeling that, yes, every gun owner who comes, or rather every person who comes into the store trying to buy a gun, they generally will have a license and they generally are reliable. We don't actually know that, and it's not always overseen. So I believe that, when we talk about regulation, we often want it to be in place, but we're often very uncertain about how it's going to happen. So, Trish, talk to me a little bit more about how guns can be regulated. I know you mentioned it before, but do you have any innovative ways in which it could be done?
Right. So, from the data which I have here, it does look like there have been quite a few permitless carry states in the U.S. And the fact that there are quite a few, it does show that they're not much. It doesn't require much for a person to go in and purchase a gun, and this does show that certain restrictions have to be put in so that a person does not have such an easy access to quite a deadly weapon, which can kill quite a few people in minutes. So, for example, a certain restriction which must be brought in my opinion, is perhaps the background check, and to check whether people have any issues of violence before, people have used guns, people have any record in their thing which does ensure which does encourage the government to prevent them from getting access to a gun. And perhaps that's one check. And another check which can be brought in is the requirement for a gun. If a person has a specific purpose, such as saying that I need the gun to, I live in an area, as I mentioned earlier, I live in quite a deserted area. I require a gun for my protection. Or if you look at it, I require a gun to maybe, I guess, for hunting, if that's a reason, if some people, if that's a reason which is permitted in certain states. Or I need a gun for, yeah, I mean, that's for a few reasons I can think of alone. So there also needs to be a certain way to ensure that each gun which is sold is traced, and each gun which is sold is registered, so that each of the ammunition sold is ensured that the state can ensure that there has been enough. There have been certain ways to trace that who has purchased certain ammunition, who has purchased certain guns, and it should be maintained in a way so that in any case, or in any, if any person finds the issue, if any person says that if there's any chance of a person misusing the gun, the state can come down and prevent it before it occurs.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a very interesting thing which you pointed out, Trish, about tracking the guns, because I believe the first two things which you had said on background checks at the moment, they are currently in place. The one wherein they do the background check on the purpose of buying the gun. Of course, like you had mentioned, I think probably from the list, there's a map which we're currently seeing at the moment. Many states like Texas, Arizona, Alaska, among them, many of them don't have any, permits for carrying the guns. Um, but the ones which do, many of them have background checks, like you had mentioned. But the one where you said, some way to track the guns and the ammunition, I think that's a very interesting thing, because at the moment, there are many illegally bought guns which the US border, and I think that's something which has been a topic of conversation as well. The US Mexico border, the illegal carteling of weapons. So I think there needs to be some way in which these guns should be tracked, because a lot of these guns can cause a lot of harm, because around 80% of guns that caused violence in the US were actually handguns. Now the ones, and those are relatively harmless, but if we're talking about actually dangerous guns like automatic guns, well, those can really really be pernicious, and I believe that those are the ones which really really should be avoided. And I think the thing which you had said as well kind of segues into our next segment of the show, which is how are guns regulated in other countries? Now, I believe that this is a pertinent topic of discussion, because when it comes to any debate, or any real discourse, we always need to get perspectives from all sides. And when it comes to talking about how guns are, when we're talking about regulation, it's important that we also look at how they are done in various parts of the world. So, Trish, we live in India. How pervasive are guns over here?
Right. So in India, there are around 9 million registered guns, and around more than 60 million unregistered ones. So it does say a lot of it does say a lot on how many guns are unregistered and how many guns seen by the government. So I mean, even though it's not like the US where you can just walk up and buy a gun anywhere, it is quite an issue in some parts of the country. And I do think that certain communities do have a constitutional right to own a gun. If I'm not wrong, I think Kyrgyz have one, and then it does. I do think that as long as they can prove the requirement for a gun and prove and establish a reason and their capability to own a gun, it even though I'm not a big fan of gun ownership, I do feel that perhaps they can be allowed to own guns in a way. But the amount of unregulated guns that go around is quite high, especially in certain states and certain areas. And I mean, both of us, we live in a quite an incubated area of the country. We live in a city. It's a huge country. There are a lot of there are various communities, and I do feel that we personally haven't seen much guns used in our area, and it does cloud our views on the amount of gun ownership. I mean, even though it is not much of an issue compared to the one in the US, it is quite significant. And I do feel that these 60 million unregistered guns have to be accounted for, and there have to be certain ways for the government to ensure that they do become legal, or they do become registered, so that they can maintain a track of the owners.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Trish. And if I just add my brief comment over here, I've actually not seen, a gun in our city. Like you mentioned, we probably live in a very secluded part, um, in terms of like seeing guns and violence. Our city is generally relatively safe in that regard. So we're very thankful for that. But of course, it's a very large country and a very diverse country, and I think that India is generally very stringent about gun ownership. They don't allow people to just go to a corner store and buy guns. Whereas in the US, it is often a comical point that you can buy your milk, you can buy your eggs, and if you're feeling a bit a bit happy, you can probably go buy yourself a handgun as well. So of course we don't want that, but and even if we that does happen, there needs to be some sort of regulation. But now I think we should talk about an even more important thing, and that's that countries with similar rates of gun ownership, but which don't seem to catch the headlines in terms of these mass shootings. And I'm going to bring up two examples here, Trish. And I'm going to start with Finland in this discussion. Finland and Switzerland are two countries which are often cited in terms of their excellent governance in terms of gun regulation and gun ownership. And I think it's important that we get some nuance over what these two countries do right. So when we talk about Finland, they have about 32 guns per 100 people, which is, well, it's not the 120 of the US, but it's still very, very high, which means that the average person may have a gun, safe to say. But what's important with Finland is, and these are some very key things which, and they overlap with what happens in Switzerland as well. And the first thing is that in Finland, there is mandatory conscription, meaning that men who are able bodied and are fit, they are by law coerced to work, and rather spend time in the military for around 2 to 3 years. Well, I believe what this does is that it brings a very positive and responsible culture of gun ownership. And culture, I believe, is the most important part, because oftentimes we talk about the culture of gun ownership in the US, and people often term it as reckless, as lawless, as barbaric. Those are all very harsh words. But when it comes to Finland, since most men, even women for that matter, since they have a very positive view of guns as being weapons, not only, I mean, rather as things which can not just, take a life, but they can also defend a life. And Finland, of course, has its own history when it comes to wars, and it very much wants to defend itself from its people. Of course, the um, uh, the most brought up example of a war, or rather Finland's defense for having this mandatory conscription, was the Winter War of 1941, where the Soviet Union invaded Finland. And even though Finland at the time was a very, very small country, because it had, a very able-bodied force of people who were able to defend themselves with their responsible use of firearms, they were able to really stick it to the Soviets. So I feel that this is a very interesting thing, and this builds a very positive mindset about guns, because people just don't think of guns as toys. People think of it as things which are used for a very important means of defending yourself from the enemy. And it's even more important now that there's a war happening right next door. Russia is currently in Ukraine, and I think that Finnish people would be definitely holding on to their guns, probably not to kill their kin, but rather to defend themselves from the enemy. So, Trish, how about you speak about Switzerland, another country which has a very high gun ownership rate?
Uh, yeah, so as you said, in Finland, like in Finland, in Switzerland, the conscription rate into the army is quite high. For Switzerland is a country which does require a method to defend itself from, in case of an attack by any of its neighbors, let's say. So the a certain regulation in certain regulations in Switzerland is the requirement for permits, and the permit to purchase a gun, a permit to purchase ammunition, and a permit to even store the gun. So it does show out how detailed the regulations are in Switzerland, and it also a lot of it's a lot of people in Switzerland, as they are have they joined the army at some stage in their lives. It does show that they do have certain levels of training, which does create a culture where they are aware on how to handle a gun responsibly, so that it's not like in the US where children are given guns just like that, and it does create a little more sense of responsibility, so that people do not misuse such a dangerous weapon. And this is quite important, and it I do feel that it would be important if such regulations do seep into the US system as well. And it would surely, in my opinion, help maintain a bit more law and order of and a bit more law and order while using firearms. Also, I do think in Switzerland, automatic rifles are, I think they are banned, and if that's the case, it's quite important because automatic rifles are quite a deadly type of firearm, and I think they're not entirely, but they're not banned in the US, which is it's quite scary, especially when people like us, people can go into schools and start shooting around and kill quite a few people. Also, in Switzerland, there have been certain restrictions, such as even when you're inheriting a gun from one of your, let's say, your parents or your grandparents, you require to sign certain documents, and that is important. Which I feel so that what may have initially been an unregistered gun, it does become registered, and it does ensure that it doesn't go into wrong hands. Guns don't. I mean, guns do not pass out. They do not pass on to people who are not trained, or they're going to use it for wrong reasons. Right. So, Kashif, what do you think is like the way forward in such a situation where gun ownership is? It's quite a debated topic.
Yeah, personally, I think that that's a very difficult question for me to answer because I, like most people in the US, and other most people in general, do want to see some form of regulation put in place because, like I think we've mentioned before, the needless loss of life due to irresponsible gun ownership, I think that's just not done. These people who've died, in these schools, like in Uvalde, they were somebody's brother, they were somebody's daughter, they were somebody's, kin. So I believe that, it's heartbreaking to hear these stories coming out every day, every week. You just don't want to see it happening again. So number one, I agree with what you were saying, that the background checks need to be put in place, but more importantly, I think the mental health of people who are actually being actually buying the guns, that those need to be assessed. Now, I have to say that none of the points which I'm actually bringing are new. Politicians have been, probably you would say, rambling about this for, at least decades now. But not much progress has been made. So I believe that there needs to be more discussions like the one that were happening right now. That's the first thing I believe, because um, I remember my mom, when I was speaking to her about this, she said that we need to be speaking about guns more in the first place, because whenever you try to artificially conceal a topic, you never get any progress. So the first thing is we need to be talking about guns more. We need to be talking about these sort of regulations, because innovation is the way forward. And you know if it when it comes to innovation, maybe these regulations will come in the way, like you were saying, maybe with the advent of technology, artificial intelligence, maybe there could be some way wherein we could track guns in a more efficient way, wherein we could make sure that if somebody is coming with a gun and it's unregulated, that that person is tracked down and they are seriously questioned. Because I believe that no matter who it is, there always could be some risk posed by someone who's having a gun without having any regulation. I think we need to have trust in the system, but we also need to have trust in the people. And that trust in the people cannot happen without us having an assurance that these people will not do any harm. So I hope that's not a very radical point of view, because I don't think either of us are against gun ownership solely. I know Trish is um, he's slightly less for guns. I don't think the Second Amendment is going to go anytime soon, but I also think that we need to build a better culture of guns, because, like we had mentioned before, like in Finland and Switzerland, there's a very responsible culture of guns. All right, and the culture is often understated. So I believe that, not only do we need to make sure with these regulations, with these background checks and stuff, not only do we need to make sure that these people are unlikely to do harm to people needlessly, but we also need to make sure that the culture of guns, the reason why we are buying it and the reason why we are using that, I think that also needs to change in the US. And I'm hoping that in the near future, that we see some change. So, any thoughts, Trish?
Yeah, as you said, as you mentioned that I am uh, less for guns. Yeah, that's something I must address because I am quite against guns. I find them quite scary, especially from a person's perspective. And I mean, but I do understand that even if I don't like it, I do understand that some people may require guns. Especially, imagine someone living in a 5 acre estate, and then a gun being their main source of security. I do understand some people may require guns, but just because someone, um, if you address the Second Amendment, just because someone has the right to own a gun doesn't mean that they don't have certain responsibilities that come attached with it. For example, I mean, you could maybe look at it from a perspective. Let's say just because you have the right to, you have a right to freedom of speech and expression, doesn't mean you have the uh, you can say hateful speech. You can make hate speech. You can make a murder threat. It's your responsibility to ensure that your speech doesn't ensure that someone gets killed. And I do feel that in the same way for guns, your gun ownership has to be responsible. And even if a person who is purchasing a gun, even if they don't require it, I do feel that there has to be there have to be certain government regulations to ensure that the gun is being sold to a person who is not going to misuse it. And I mean, I do said the background checks may address such an issue. I do also think that if you compare to Switzerland, let's say, the mass shootings in Switzerland is comparatively less. I would not want to say insignificant because there has been a loss of life there, and it is condolences there as well. But the thing is, it's quite insignificant. It's quite comparatively less compared to that in the US. And I do think that perhaps mental health is not the main. It is perhaps mental health is not the sole issue gun with why there is such a contrast in terms of mass shootings. So there have to be regulations brought in, and for example, I think the ATF requires certain funding to it should have increased funding so that they can ensure that each bullet sold is traced, each gun sold is traced, and the proper system and culture is established so that people ensure that when they purchase a gun, they've been registered onto a database, and people and the government knows that certain people have access to a gun, so that in case there is going to be an issue, they could step in and ensure consequences are not consequences are prevented to a larger extent.
Yeah, all right. So I think that's going to bring us to the end of this wonderful and hopefully very educational discourse that we've had. I want to just, we probably should have put the disclaimer at the start, but we aren't experts in any manner. We're just two very curious students who want to sort of bring out our opinions on this hotly contested issue that is gun ownership in the US. We obviously don't live in the US, so it probably seems very cushy for us to talk about it. But I also think that since the US it's a very interesting case study on how laws can sometimes become so stringent in that people are often very resistant towards change. Now, I don't believe that every person like this is in the US, but there are a lot of people who do think that any form of regulation is an infringement. like mentioned in the Second Amendment. So, that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the very first episode of Vox Rationis, and please do tell us in the comments down below if there are things you would like to change, if we've maybe made some errors, if there are things you would like to see happening on our next episode. And I hope you guys tune in for the next episode as well. So, Trish?
Yeah, kindly do give in your comments, your input. We do value them, and we surely hope to improve upon our arguments. And I mean, after all, we are students. We are trying to improve our argument skills. We are trying to improve our thought process. So we do value your input. Kindly do give some if you have any. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.